What if I told you that one of the most powerful dynasties in European history, a family that ruled vast empires for centuries, was ultimately destroyed, not by war, not by invasion, but by their own bloodline? A dynasty so obsessed with keeping power in the family that their marriages turned into genetic time bombs. Tonight, we're diving into the tragic and eerie story of the Habsburg dynasty, a tale of power, inbreeding, and ultimate extinction. Stay with me until the end, because what happened to them is stranger than fiction, and it changed the fate of Europe forever. The rise of the Habsburgs. The Habsburg dynasty began humbly in the 11th century in Switzerland. Through centuries of clever marriages and ruthless strategy, they rose to dominate European politics. By the 15th and 16th centuries, the Habsburgs controlled Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, and even vast colonies in the Americas. Their motto, whispered through generations, became famous: Bella Garant Ali tu Felix Austria Nubi. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. Instead of spilling blood on the battlefield, the Habsburgs forged alliances through marriage. And it worked, for a time. But behind this genius strategy was a hidden curse. These marriages were not just political alliances, they were often between close relatives. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and sometimes even closer ties were considered. Each generation tightened the genetic knot. The Habsburg inbreeding and their extinction. While most royal families sought alliances with powerful outsiders to strengthen their reign, the Habsburgs chose a path that would ultimately become their undoing. Their motto was unspoken but clear: keep the bloodline pure, keep the power within. And so, instead of looking outward, they looked inward. Cousins married cousins, uncles wed nieces, and distant branches of the family were folded back into themselves. Every wedding was less about love or diplomacy and more about controlling destiny, or so they believed. But nature has its own rules, and it does not bend to human ambition. By the 1500s, Habsburg marriages had reached extremes that were almost unimaginable. Modern genetic studies reveal that by the time Charles II of Spain was born, the inbreeding coefficient of the family had reached 0.25, the same genetic risk as if his parents had been brother and sister. This was not just a number, it was a genetic time bomb. Harmful recessive traits, harmless in other families, now stacked upon one another, with every generation amplifying their destructive power. The physical consequences were impossible to ignore. The Habsburg jaw, a grotesque protruding lower jaw, became a defining feature of the dynasty. Portraits of kings and queens show thick lips, elongated chins, and faces that almost seem frozen by heredity. It was a family visage both recognizable and unsettling, a symbol of power twisted into a mark of misfortune. But the effects went far beyond appearances. Miscarriages haunted the family, countless infants never lived to see their first birthday, and children who survived were often weak, sickly, or mentally impaired. Fertility declined sharply, leaving entire generations vulnerable to extinction. The rulers themselves, meant to embody strength and wisdom, were often frail or incapable of governing. The very blood that the Habsburgs prized became a chain, binding them to a tragic fate. Even politically, the consequences were dire. Weak monarchs created opportunities for court intrigue, corruption, and manipulation. Ambitious advisors and foreign powers exploited the dynasty's vulnerabilities. The very strategy meant to consolidate power, marriage within the family, became a silent assassin, slowly unraveling an empire that had once stretched across continents. And yet, the family continued, generation after generation, doubling down on the same strategy. It was as if the Habsburgs were blind to the warning signs, addicted to their own logic. Each marriage, each child, each generation compounded the genetic curse, tightening the web that would one day strangle them completely. The true horror of this strategy is most vividly seen in Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's most tragic figure. Born centuries of intermarriage into a lineage burdened with genetic flaws, he would inherit the full weight of this curse. A living testament to the danger of ambition run amok, of power sought without regard for nature's limits. But the story of the Habsburgs isn't just about strange faces in royal portraits. It's about the collapse of empires, the fall of dynasties, and how the fate of millions of people hinged on one family's obsession with bloodlines. The science of the Habsburg bloodline. Centuries later, scientists examined their family tree, and the results were shocking. Of the 16 marriages in the Spanish Habsburg line, 10 were between close relatives. The inbreeding caused the repeated expression of harmful recessive genes. Symptoms included epilepsy, infertility, hydrocephalus, fluid in the brain, and physical deformities. Many children of the dynasty never reached adulthood, and those who did often ruled with frail health. The Habsburg jaw became the most iconic feature, so pronounced in some rulers that they struggled to chew food properly. But the worst genetic consequences were yet to come. Charles II of Spain, the living curse. By the time Charles VI of Spain was born in 1661, the Habsburg bloodline had already become a precarious house of cards, each generation more fragile than the last. From the very beginning, Charles was a child of misfortune. He was slow to reach milestones. He didn't speak until he was 4, and he didn't walk until he was 8. His body, twisted by centuries of inbreeding, bore the unmistakable Habsburg jaw, an extreme protrusion of the lower jaw that made eating and speaking agonizing struggles. But his suffering went far beyond appearance. Charles was plagued by seizures, chronic illness, and severe developmental delays. Some historians even describe him as mentally impaired, unable to understand the world in ways most rulers needed to survive. And the cruelest blow of all, he was completely infertile. Despite 2 marriages and countless hopes pinned on him to continue the dynasty, Charles II produced no heirs. The Spanish Habsburg line, a dynasty that had also ruled an empire where the sun never set, was coming to an end. The palace whispered of curses. Some called him El Hechizado, the bewitched, believing dark magic had doomed him. But the truth was far more chilling. Science and ambition had done what no sorcerer could. Centuries of inbreeding, obsession with bloodline purity, and relentless dynastic marriages had culminated in one tragic figure, whose very body and mind were a reflection of the family's self-inflicted genetic collapse. Under his reign, Spain, already in decline, faltered further. Charles was too frail, too sickly, and too weak to assert real authority. Court factions thrived, foreign powers maneuvered, and the empire that had once dominated Europe now struggled to maintain relevance. One man, the culmination of centuries of dynastic obsession, symbolized the end of an era. And when Charles II died in 1700 without an heir, it wasn't just a king who passed away. It was the extinction of a dynasty. The Spanish Habsburgs, whose marriages had once been celebrated as a masterstroke of political strategy, were gone forever. Their obsession with inbreeding, meant to preserve power, had instead delivered ruin. Before we go further, let me pause here. If you're fascinated by these chilling stories of history and how dynasties rise and fall, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We're on a mission to reach 100,000 subscribers this year, and we cannot do it without every single one of you. Now, let's continue the dark tale of the Habsburgs. Political consequences of inbreeding. The consequences of Charles II's reign went far beyond his personal suffering. They shook Spain and Europe to its core. Once the wealthiest and most powerful empire on the continent, Spain faced rapid decline under his rule. The king's frailty and mental incapacity left him unable to govern effectively, and the empire's administration fell into chaos. Economic collapse spread as trade faltered and taxation systems broke down. Military defeats mounted as once dominant Spanish forces struggled to defend their territories against ambitious rivals. Court factions thrived in the power vacuum, each vying for influence over a monarch who could barely assert control. Foreign powers, sensing weakness, manipulated decisions and treaties to serve their own agendas. Spain's colonies suffered under neglect, while the empire's rivals, including France, England, and the merging Austrian Habsburgs, began to encroach on its influence. By the time Charles II died, the Spain that had dominated Europe under his great-grandparents, Charles V and Philip, had become a shadow of its former glory, weakened, divided, and politically vulnerable. The War of Spanish Succession. Charles II's death in 1700, childless and without an heir, sparked one of the most significant conflicts in European history, the War of Spanish Succession. The central question was explosive. Who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire, stretching across Europe and the Americas? Competing claims emerged almost immediately. The French Bourbons put forward Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, while the Austrian Habsburgs claimed their right through lineage connections. Europe erupted into war as alliances formed on both sides, dragging nations into a conflict that would last 13 years. This war was not just about land and titles, it was about the balance of power in Europe itself. Battles raged across Spain, Italy, and the Low Countries, leaving a trail of devastation in their wake. In the end, the Bourbons triumphed, and Philip V ascended the Spanish throne, establishing the Bourbon dynasty in Spain. The Spanish Habsburgs, the dynasty that had once ruled an empire on which the sun never set, were extinct, their bloodline erased from the political map of Europe. The extinction of the Spanish Habsburgs reshaped European politics permanently. It marked the end of an era in which one family could dominate the continent through strategic marriages alone. The inbreeding that had plagued Charles II did not just destroy a man, it destabilized an empire and altered the course of history. But here's the chilling part. Even as the Spanish branch died out, the Austrian Habsburgs clung to survival. Yet their time was also running out. The Austrian Habsburgs, a fragile survival. The Austrian line of the Habsburgs, though slightly more fortunate than their Spanish cousins, was far from immune to the consequences of centuries of inbreeding. Cousin marriages and unions between distant relatives continued relentlessly, and each generation bore the physical and mental toll of this genetic isolation. Infant mortality remained alarmingly high, and even rulers who survived into adulthood were often frail, sickly, or burdened with chronic ailments. Despite these hardships, the Austrian Habsburgs managed to maintain political influence across Europe. They married strategically, built alliances, and preserved the appearance of imperial strength. Yet beneath this veneer, the dynasty was teetering on the edge of collapse. The culmination came in 1780 with the death of Maria Theresa, the last of the pure Austrian Habsburg line. Her marriage to Francis of Lorraine allowed the dynasty to continue under the name Habsburg-Lorraine, but the original genetic line, the one that had ruled Europe for centuries, was gone forever. What remained was a shadow of their former glory, a dynasty that had survived politically but was irrevocably hollowed out by its own bloodline. Historiography and modern science. For centuries, the fate of Charles II and the Habsburgs was shrouded in superstition and rumor. Tales of curses, witchcraft, and divine punishment circulated through the courts of Europe, painting the dynasty as victims of mystical forces beyond their control. Observers marveled at Charles's appearance, his disabilities, and his inability to produce heirs, but few understood the true cause. Modern genetic science, however, has lifted the veil. Researchers examining the Habsburg family tree have concluded that their decline was not magic, it was biology. They are now recognized as one of the most extreme examples of royal inbreeding in history, a case where centuries of strategic marriages inadvertently programmed weakness and tragedy into their very DNA. The dynasty's downfall was not merely political, it was encoded in their genes. Every deformity, every fragile ruler, every lost generation can be traced to the same obsessive drive to keep power in the family, a drive that ultimately ensured their extinction. Legacy and lessons. The Habsburg story leaves behind a chilling legacy. Their portraits, with faces marked by the unmistakable Habsburg jaw, still hang in the grand museums of Europe. Their palaces, monuments to wealth and power, remain standing, testaments to centuries of political dominance. Yet behind these symbols of glory lies a cautionary tale. No amount of wealth, influence, or empire can override the laws of biology. Their obsession with dynastic purity, intended to strengthen their line, became a slow-acting curse. Weak rulers, infertile heirs, and genetic deformities compounded over generations, ultimately unraveling what they had built. And in the end, it was not foreign armies, rebellions, or political rivals that ended the Habsburgs' reign. It was themselves, their ambition, and their disregard for the natural limits of human heredity. The Habsburgs are a reminder to history. Power may last generations, but biology is impartial. And sometimes, the most formidable threat to a dynasty comes not from without, but from within. If you've made it this far, you now know the chilling story of the Habsburgs, a dynasty that ruled the world, but couldn't escape its own bloodline. What do you think? Were they victims of ambition or of ignorance about science they couldn't yet understand? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget, like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Every single one of you helps keep stories like this alive. Together, we're building a community that uncovers history's darkest secrets.